You know, when we think about the Battle of the Bulge, December 1944, Germany's last big, desperate push in the West, our minds usually go to images of heroic soldiers in the snow, of brilliant tactics and brutal fighting. But what if I told you the real story? The secret that decided the whole thing wasn't about the soldiers or their generals. What if it was about something much more basic? Something that was, or more importantly, wasn't, in their tanks.
And I want you to really think about that question for a second, because this is the absolute heart of the story. Germany had just rolled out its new monster, the Tiger II. We're talking about a 68-ton beast of a tank that Allied shells just bounced off of. It was, on paper, a war-winning machine. But all that power, all that thick armor, it came at a terrible price. It had an unbelievable thirst for fuel, a thirst that would become its Achilles heel, its fatal flaw. And this quote, this puts you right there in the freezing cold, in the middle of the crisis. Just try to put yourself in Joachim Peiper's boots. You're the commander of this elite SS Panzer unit, the very tip of the German spear. You've broken through the lines and you are just a few miles away from a massive American fuel depot. You can practically smell the gasoline, 2.2 million gallons of it, the fuel that could get you to Antwerp and maybe, just maybe, win the war. But your state-of-the-art tanks, these perfect, invincible machines, they're silent. They're completely, utterly stopped. Not by an enemy, but by an empty fuel gauge. They're just monuments to failure, as he said. Now, Piper's personal hell on the battlefield, that was really just a symptom of a much, much bigger problem. The Battle of the Bulge wasn't just a clash of armies. No, it was a collision between two fundamentally different industrial worlds. And when you look at the numbers, you'll see it was all just a simple, brutal arithmetic of annihilation. Just look at the two philosophies laid bare on this slide. It tells you everything you need to know. On the German side, a desperate gamble. Their plan, literally, was to drive until the tanks sputter to a halt and then steal the enemy's fuel to keep the attack going. That was the plan. Now look at the American side. It's not even on the same planet. It was a system built on overwhelming, unbelievable abundance. Their goal was to make capturing enemy fuel totally irrelevant, an afterthought. And if you want to know why the Germans were so desperate, well, here are the numbers, and they are absolutely staggering. In 1941, Germany managed to produce about 5.7 million tons of oil. The United States, by itself, produced 180 million tons. That's not a disadvantage. That's not a gap. That's a different universe. No amount of tactical genius, no level of battlefield bravery could ever hope to close a gap like that. And listen, this isn't us just looking back with 80 years of hindsight. They knew it. They knew it from the very beginning. This entry from a German major's war diary says it all. The entire operation depended on stealing fuel. It wasn't a military offensive in the traditional sense. It was, as another commander later called it, organized banditry. They were soldiers forced to be fuel thieves because their own country was running on fumes. Okay, so on one side you have scarcity. On the other, this almost infinite resource. So how did the Americans actually weaponize that advantage? How did they turn oil in the ground in Texas into victory in the Ardennes forest? Well, they built the single most incredible logistics machine the world had ever seen. So let me introduce you to the Red Ball Express. It was basically a non-stop, 24/7 highway of supply trucks, almost 6,000 of them, running on dedicated one-way roads to the front. At its peak, it was delivering 12,500 tons of supplies every single day. And the biggest category of supplies? You guessed it, petroleum. The irony here is just incredible. The Red Ball Express was so massive, it burned 300,000 gallons of its own fuel every day just to deliver even more fuel to the front. There's a story of one driver who spilled 50 gallons and was just told, "Don't worry about it, that's why we bring extra." They weren't counting gallons, they were counting tanker ships. And if a never-ending convoy of trucks wasn't enough, get ready for Operation Pluto. That stands for Pipeline Under the Ocean. I mean, this is pure engineering genius right out of science fiction. The Allies literally laid flexible pipelines on the seabed of the English Channel, creating this petroleum circulatory system that pumped over 1 million gallons a day directly from Britain to the front lines. It was like giving the entire Allied army a main artery of pure fuel that could never be bombed, never be stopped by weather. It was invincible. And this quote from an American petroleum engineer on the ground just nails it, doesn't it? The two sides were living in completely different realities. The Germans were hoarding fuel, counting every drop. The Americans were measuring it by the tanker load. And you have to understand, this logistical power wasn't just supporting the war effort. In many ways, it was the war effort. So we've seen the big picture, right? The massive industrial difference, the incredible supply lines. But what did all of that actually look like for the soldiers on the ground? Let's zoom right back into those freezing forests of the Ardennes and see the human consequences. This timeline tracks the incredibly fast death of Germany's most powerful combat group, Kampfgruppe Piper. Just look at this. In only 3 days, they go from being this feared, unstoppable armored spearhead to a static collection of useless metal. And what stopped them? It wasn't a wall of American tanks. It was blown bridges that forced them to take long detours. It was muddy fields that doubled their fuel consumption. They were ultimately defeated by geography and an empty fuel gauge. And the contrast between the two experiences on the ground is, well, it's just staggering. You have German tankers, the best in the world, being ordered to abandon their perfectly good tanks just because the fuel gauge hit 0. At the same time, American crews were under orders to drain their fuel tanks after 3 days and replace the old gasoline with fresh stuff. Think about that. German soldiers were scrounging for a few drops of discarded gasoline in a canteen, while American tank crews kept their engines running all night long just to use the engine heat to stay warm inside. And this is where that desperation had truly horrific consequences. We have to talk about the infamous Malmedy massacre, where 84 American prisoners of war were murdered in a field. It was an atrocity, and it was driven directly by this frantic need for speed. Piper's column couldn't afford any delays. They couldn't be slowed down by prisoners. They were in a desperate race against their own fuel gauges to capture those American depots. It's a terrible truth that resource poverty fueled that brutality. And now, let's look at the absolute peak of American logistical power, the counterpunch. To relieve the surrounded 101st Airborne at Bastogne, General Patton's Third Army literally turned 3 entire divisions 90 degrees and drove them over 100 miles through the snow in just 3 days. That single maneuver consumed 800,000 gallons of fuel. Just let that sink in for a moment. A single American counterattack used almost as much fuel as the Germans had managed to scrape together for their entire offensive. So when you put all of these pieces together, the industrial might, the logistics, the desperation on the ground, the ultimate lesson of the Battle of the Bulge becomes brutally, undeniably clear. You know, you don't have to take my word for it. Perhaps the German air ace and general, Adolf Galland, summed it up better than anyone ever could. It wasn't a fair fight between soldiers. It was, in his words, a deluge of resources that simply washed the German war machine away. They were drowned in gasoline. Let's just look at the final, brutal arithmetic, the final score. Germany cobbled together just over 3 million gallons of fuel for the whole offensive. The U.S. Army? They had 42 million gallons just sitting in reserve, in theater. By the end of the battle, Germany had lost thousands of vehicles, most of them simply abandoned for lack of fuel. And the Americans, get this, they actually ended the battle with more fuel in their reserves than when they started. It was an equation that Germany never, ever had a chance of solving. And this brings us right back to the individual soldier. This is the final report from one of Germany's greatest tank aces, Kurt Nippel. His King Tiger tank was a rolling fortress, a masterpiece of lethal engineering. So how was this nearly invincible machine defeated? Not by an enemy shell, not by a mine, but by nothing, by absence, an empty space in a fuel tank, facing an enemy who seemed to have an infinite supply. So why does all this matter today? Well, the Battle of the Bulge teaches us a timeless and pretty stark lesson. Courage and technology and brilliant strategy, they mean absolutely nothing without the resources to sustain them. And it forces us to ask a really critical question about our own world. In our incredibly complex, interconnected society with our global supply chains, what is our gasoline? What's the one critical resource that powers everything else? What is it that we, today, simply cannot afford to run out of?